On a rainy Tuesday afternoon in late October, a man named Daniel Mercer drove his dented pickup truck down a gravel road that barely appeared on any map, following handwritten directions scrawled on a napkin by a real estate agent who had seemed almost relieved to hand the listing off. The property at the end of that road, a two-story farmhouse with a sagging porch and a garage that leaned like a man too tired to stand straight, was listed at $42,000, which made it the cheapest available property within 60 miles of town. Daniel had exactly $43,800 left in his savings account after the divorce was finalized. He had looked at the number on his bank statement for a long time before deciding it meant something, some kind of strange permission from the universe to start over. He was 38 years old. He had a daughter named Sophie, who was 9, who spent weekdays with her mother and weekends with him, and who had recently told him, with the devastating honesty that only children possess, that she wished he had a real house instead of an apartment that smelled like the neighbor's cooking. That comment had stayed with him for 3 weeks before he called the real estate agent. Daniel was a freelance mechanic by trade, a man who had spent 20 years learning the language of engines, the particular cough of a failing timing belt, the hesitation in a fuel injector running lean, the deep knock of a crankshaft bearing that had given everything it had to give. He understood machines the way some people understood music, intuitively and completely, able to hear what was wrong before he ever lifted a hood. He was not a wealthy man and had never particularly wanted to be one. But he was skilled, and skilled was usually enough to keep the lights on. The divorce had changed the math on that. 2 households cost more than one, and Sophie's school supplies, and the apartment rent, and the truck payments, and the child support all added up in ways that made him lie awake at 3 in the morning doing arithmetic that never came out right. The farmhouse was not a dream. It was a calculation. He figured if he owned the property outright, if he eliminated rent from the equation entirely, he could breathe again. He could fix whatever was wrong with his own hands. That was something he knew how to do. What he had not fully anticipated was the reaction of the people who lived nearby. When he stopped at the gas station 2 miles from the property to ask about the water pressure in the area, the woman behind the counter had looked at him with an expression he could not quite classify, somewhere between pity and warning. She told him the farmhouse on Alden Road had been empty for going on 22 years, that the man who had owned it originally had vanished one summer without a word to anyone, and that the 3 families who had moved in after that, all of them lured by the low price, just as Daniel had been, had each left within a year, citing things they could not explain, sounds at night, a persistent feeling of being watched, a roof that repaired itself in ways they had not authorized. Daniel thanked her and drove the remaining 2 miles without adjusting his thinking at all. He did not believe in curses. He believed in deferred maintenance and local mythology, and he knew from long experience that both of them had a way of driving property values down to levels that made rational men very happy. He signed the papers the following Friday. He moved his tools in the following Monday. He gave himself 3 months to make the house livable before Sophie came for her first weekend stay, and he started with the garage because it was the most structurally compromised and because a mechanic without a proper workspace was not fully himself. The garage floor was buried under decades of accumulated debris, old paint cans rusted shut, a push mower with a cracked deck, cardboard boxes that had dissolved into a soft brown mulch, broken terracotta pots, a child's bicycle frame stripped of its wheels, and beneath all of it, a layer of compacted dirt and gravel that had been undisturbed for so long it had achieved something close to the density of concrete. Daniel worked methodically, the way he always did, starting at the perimeter and working inward, hauling load after load to the rented dumpster at the end of the driveway. On the 4th day, with the rain coming down hard on the corrugated metal roof and the single overhead bulb swinging slightly in a draft he could not locate, he drove a pointed spade into the center of the garage floor and felt it stop dead against something solid. He assumed it was a buried foundation stone. He moved 2 feet to the left and tried again. The same resistance. He crouched down and brushed the dirt away with his gloved hands. And the first thing he uncovered, curved and smooth and unmistakably man-made, was a length of chrome trim that still carried a faint, impossible gleam. He dug for the rest of that afternoon and into the evening, long after the rain stopped and the temperature dropped, and his breath began to show in small clouds under the work light he had clamped to a rafter. The shape that emerged from the earth was patient, unhurried, as if it had been waiting for exactly this, and had no anxiety about the timing. A hood. Then the long slope of a fender, then the blunt angle of a door panel, and finally, after nearly 4 hours of digging that left his shoulders burning and his knees caked with dark soil, the unmistakable silhouette of a complete automobile, buried nose down at a slight angle, occupying almost the entire center of the garage floor beneath nearly 2 feet of carefully packed earth. It was a BMW, an older one, from the lines of it early 1980s. He guessed, though he would need better light to be certain. What stopped him from thinking about the make and model at all, for a long moment, was the condition of it. In 20 years of working on cars, Daniel Mercer had never seen a vehicle survive burial in anything like this state. The paint, a dark, metallic navy blue, was present and largely unbroken. There was no rust visible on the panels he had uncovered. Someone had wrapped the car in a heavy, industrial-grade moisture barrier before burying it, and that barrier had done its job with extraordinary fidelity. He did not sleep that night. He went back to the garage with a flashlight after midnight and walked around the car, crouching to examine it from every angle, pressing his palm flat against the cool, smooth metal of the roof. The tires, astonishingly, held their shape. The window glass was intact. The chrome work on the grille and the trim rings around the headlights was tarnished, but unbroken. Whoever had put this car in the ground had done so with tremendous care, as if they were not hiding it, but preserving it, as if they expected it to be found someday and wanted it to be found whole. He shone the flashlight through the driver's window and saw the interior. Tan leather seats, with a fine layer of dust, but no mold. A wooden dashboard that had held its finish. And on the passenger seat, arranged with a deliberateness that made the hair on the back of his neck rise. 3 objects. A watch, leather-strapped and heavy-faced, lying flat. A small brass key with a number stamped on its bow, and a white envelope, sealed, with writing on the front in a hand that was careful and unhurried, as if the writer had taken their time. For the one who finds this, Daniel left the envelope where it was. He was not sure why. Exactly some instinct that said this was not a thing to be done alone in a cold garage at 2 in the morning. He went inside, made coffee he did not taste, and sat at the kitchen table until the sky began to pale in the east, thinking about what a man buries a car for and what he means when he leaves a letter behind. The coffee went cold. The answer did not come, but the question kept circling, and Daniel recognized it for what it was. The beginning of something that was not going to resolve itself easily or quickly, and that was almost certainly going to change the quiet, manageable future he had been trying so carefully to construct. He never considered keeping it secret. That was simply not the kind of man Daniel Mercer was. He told his neighbor, Walter, the retired schoolteacher who lived a quarter-mile down the road and who had brought him a casserole on his first night in the house, because Walter seemed like someone who would know what to do. Walter came over within the hour, looked at the car for a very long time without saying anything, and then took out his phone and started filming without asking Daniel's permission, not out of malice but out of the pure, uncomplicated excitement of a man who had lived quietly in a small town for 30 years and suddenly found himself adjacent to something extraordinary. The video Walter posted to his personal page was modest, shaky, and under 2 minutes long. It had 400,000 views by the following morning. After that, the property on Alden Road became something it had never been before, a destination. The calls began arriving before Daniel had finished his first cup of coffee on the day after the video spread. A collector from Atlanta who introduced himself as representing a consortium of vintage automobile enthusiasts and offered to send an appraiser at his own expense. A journalist from a regional newspaper who wanted to come out that afternoon. A man who identified himself only as Marcus, who said he had information about the previous owner of the property and would share it in exchange for being present when the car was removed from the ground. By noon, there were 2 news vans parked at the end of the driveway and a small crowd of locals who had materialized the way people do when something worth seeing is happening, and they do not want to be the last to know about it. Daniel stood at the garage door with his arms crossed and a specific expression on his face, calm, unbothered, politely immovable, and told everyone the same thing. The car was on his property, it was not going anywhere, and he was not speaking to anyone until he understood what he was dealing with. The appraiser came on the second day, a meticulous man named Gerald, who arrived in a pressed linen jacket and spent 4 hours examining every square inch of the BMW without touching anything except with gloved fingertips. He identified it as a 1983 BMW M1, one of fewer than 450 ever manufactured, and one of perhaps a handful in this specific configuration, a prototype adjacent specification, he said carefully, that suggested the car had never been offered to the public at all. He gave Daniel a range for its value at auction that started at $3 million and climbed, depending on provenance, to something considerably higher. Daniel thanked him, walked him to his car, and went back to the garage and stood in front of the M1 for a long time, doing the arithmetic the way he always did, and finding that the numbers were so large they had stopped behaving like numbers and started behaving like weather, real, undeniable, but impossible to fully reckon with in any practical sense. On the third day, a lawyer arrived. He was a compact, well-dressed man named Harrison, who represented a firm Daniel had never heard of, and he sat across from Daniel at the kitchen table and explained, with the measured precision of a man who chose every word, the way a surgeon chooses a scalpel, that his clients had been searching for this specific vehicle for a period of approximately 20 years, that there were legitimate questions about its legal provenance and ownership that would need to be resolved before any transfer of possession could occur, and that his clients were prepared to be very cooperative and very generous if Daniel was willing to engage in that process. Daniel asked who his clients were. Harrison said he was not at liberty to say. Daniel thanked him and showed him to the door. It was on the fourth morning that the helicopter came. Daniel heard it before he saw it, a low, steady thrum that grew until it became a physical presence in the chest, then a shape resolving out of the pale November sky, a sleek private helicopter that descended toward the flat pasture behind the house, with the unhurried authority of something that had never once been told it could not land wherever it chose. Daniel walked to the back fence and watched it settle into the grass, the rotors slowing and then stopping entirely, and he waited. The door opened. One person stepped out. No security detail, no assistants, no entourage of the kind that usually surrounded people who arrived by helicopter. Just a woman, perhaps 40 years old, in dark trousers and a charcoal coat, her dark hair pulled back, walking across the wet grass toward him with a directness that said she had thought carefully about this moment and was not nervous about it at all. Her name was Victoria Harland. She did not offer a business card or a title. But Daniel would learn later that she did not need to. She was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most significant figures in the technology investment world, a woman who had built a reputation for seeing value where others saw only complexity and for holding her positions, in business and in life, long after other people had moved on to something easier. She was cold, in the sense that warmth did not appear on her surface immediately. She was also, Daniel would discover, one of the most precise and honest people he had ever encountered, and those qualities, which he recognized because he shared them, made him more willing to stand still in the wet grass and listen than he would have been for almost anyone else. She walked straight to the garage. She stood in front of the BMW for a long time, longer than the appraiser had, longer than the journalist, longer than any of the collectors who had sent photographs and offers and urgent requests. She looked at it the way Daniel had looked at it that first night. Not calculating, not appraising, but with something closer to grief, as if she were looking at a face she had spent 20 years trying to remember clearly, and finding that she had remembered it almost exactly right. When she finally spoke, she turned to look at him first, with gray eyes that were entirely steady, and she said, "I will give you $10 million for this car." The number landed in the silence of the garage, the way a stone lands in deep water, not a splash but a depth. And before Daniel could speak, she said, "But I need you to hear the full story first. That is my only condition." Daniel Mercer was not a man who was moved by large numbers. He had never particularly wanted to be rich, had never organized his life around the accumulation of wealth. What he had always wanted, what had driven every decision he had made since the age of 20, when he had first picked up a wrench with real intention, was to understand things, how they worked, why they had broken, what would make them whole again. He looked at Victoria Harland, and he recognized, with a certainty that surprised him, that she was not lying, and was not performing, and was not running a strategy on him. She was asking for something she needed in the only way she knew how, which was directly and without decoration, and she had attached a price to it not because she thought he could be bought, but because she had learned that people took things seriously when there was something real at stake. He pulled 2 folding chairs from the wall, set them facing each other in the middle of the garage with the M1 between them. And he sat down. She sat across from him. And she began. 23 years ago, Victoria Harland's father, a man named Robert Harland, had been one of the most promising engineers in the country. He was not famous in the way that technologists became famous later, through product launches and press profiles and social media presence. He was famous in the way that people who are genuinely exceptional become known within their fields quietly, by reputation, through the testimony of people who had seen what he could do and never quite recovered from the experience. Robert Harland had spent the better part of a decade developing a proprietary engine management system that solved several problems in fuel efficiency and performance that the industry had accepted as inherent limitations. He had built this system largely on his own time, in his own workshop, funding his research through a series of consulting contracts, and he had brought it to market through a partnership with a man named Edward Whitmore, a financier with extensive connections in the automotive supply chain, who had recognized the commercial value of Robert's work and offered to provide the capital and the industry relationships needed to bring it to scale. The partnership had appeared, on paper and in person, to be a genuine meeting of complementary strengths. Whitmore provided the money and the access. Robert provided the technology and the credibility. For 18 months, they had worked together in a way that Robert described to his daughter, in those evenings when she was old enough to understand some of what he was saying, as the most productive period of his professional life. And then, things had begun to change. Small things at first, contracts that appeared to have been modified after Robert had reviewed them, royalty calculations that did not match the agreed-upon terms, licensing agreements signed in his name that he had not authorized. Robert had raised these concerns with Whitmore directly, carefully, without accusation, giving the man every opportunity to offer an innocent explanation. No innocent explanation came. What came instead was a campaign of financial entanglement, so thorough and so deliberately constructed that by the time Robert understood what had happened, his name was attached to 3 separate fraudulent filings, a pattern of conduct that, if left to stand, would have destroyed his reputation and potentially resulted in criminal charges. He had the evidence to refute it. He had the documentation, the original contracts, the unmodified filings, the communications that showed clearly who had done what and when and why. But he also understood, with the clarity of a man who had always been better at engineering than at institutional politics, that the evidence needed to be preserved in a way that could not be tampered with, could not be purchased, could not be made to disappear by a man with Edward Whitmore's resources and connections. So Robert Harland had made a decision that Victoria had spent 20 years trying to understand, and that she was only now, sitting in a stranger's garage in the presence of an unearthed car she had loved as a girl, beginning to fully accept. He had hidden the evidence in the car. The M1 had been a vehicle he had purchased in his 30s and maintained with a devotion that was almost sentimental, because he had been, underneath all the engineering and the professional precision, a man who simply loved beautiful machines. He had loaded the car with everything. The original contracts, the unmodified filings, the communications chain that laid out Whitmore's fraud in complete and prosecutable detail, the engineering documentation that proved Robert's ownership of the technology, and a detailed accounting of the financial manipulation that had been used to obscure it. He had preserved it all in sealed archival containers, had wrapped the car in the industrial moisture barrier with the same methodical care he applied to everything he built, and he had buried it in the garage of a farmhouse he had acquired years earlier as investment property. He had then, And this was the part Victoria had never been able to fully reconcile: disappeared. He had left no forwarding address, no explanation, no word to his daughter, or to anyone else who cared about him. He had simply stepped out of his life and not returned. And for 20 years, Victoria had been living inside the shape of that absence, trying to understand whether her father had been a victim, a coward, or something more complex than either of those words could hold. Daniel listened to all of this without interrupting. He was a man who knew how to be still when stillness was needed, who had learned in 20 years of working on cars that there was a moment in every diagnostic process when the right thing to do was simply to stop talking and listen to what the machine was trying to tell you. When Victoria finished, the garage was very quiet. The rain had returned, tapping lightly on the corrugated roof. He looked at her for a moment, and then he looked at the envelope on the passenger seat, visible through the window of the M1, its white face carrying those 6 words in careful handwriting. He said, "We should open it together." It was not a question. Victoria looked at the envelope. Something shifted in her face, the first visible shift since she had arrived, a crack in the surface through which something much more vulnerable briefly showed itself. She nodded once. He opened the car with the key from the cob itself, which fit the door lock with the smooth precision of something kept in perfect mechanical order, and retrieved the envelope with careful hands. They stood side by side at the workbench while Daniel slit the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded in thirds, covered on both sides in the same careful handwriting as the address on the front. Daniel held it so they could both read it at the same time. Robert Harland had written the letter not knowing who would find it or when. He had written it as a man writes something he knows may need to last a very long time. Which is to say, he had written it simply and without flourish, saying what needed to be said and nothing more. He told whoever was reading that they were holding evidence of a crime that had been committed against him, and that it was his hope, his belief, that the person holding this letter was someone honest, because only an honest person, he had decided, would have found this car and not simply sold it without asking any questions. He asked that whoever found it not sell it and not give it to anyone whose only interest was financial. He said the car, and what it contained, belonged to the person who could be trusted to do something true with both of them. And at the bottom, in a postscript that was written in a slightly different hand, as if added after a pause, he had written, "For my daughter, if she is still looking, I did not leave because I stopped loving you. I left because I was afraid, and that was the mistake of my life. And I am sorrier for it than any words in any language I know." Victoria Harland, who had not cried in front of another person in longer than she could precisely remember, stood at a workbench in a stranger's garage in rural November and wept. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in the complete and unguarded way of someone who has been holding something for so long that the moment of release is also a moment of total bewilderment, as if the muscles of her entire body had forgotten, over 20 years, how to do anything other than hold on. Daniel set the letter down on the workbench and walked to the garage door and looked out at the rain for a while, giving her the privacy of his turned back, because he was a man who understood that some things needed to happen without being observed. The brass key, they discovered the following morning, belonged to a safe deposit box at a bank in a town 30 miles south, a branch of an institution that had been absorbed into a larger region. In the quiet way that institutional memory sometimes persists, the box itself and its contents, the annual fee having been set up on an automatic payment from an account that had simply never been closed. Daniel drove. Victoria sat in the passenger seat of his truck and looked out the window at the passing countryside, and they did not speak very much. And the silence between them was not uncomfortable, but was instead the particular silence of two people who are each aware that they are in the middle of something that is going to require them to figure out who they actually are. The bank manager, a practical woman named Carol, who had been working at the branch for 19 years and had a gift for treating extraordinary circumstances with the quiet efficiency of someone who had seen everything, located the box and led them to the vault without ceremony. The key fit. Inside was everything Robert Harland had promised and more. 6 sealed archival folders containing the original contracts, the complete unmodified filing record, 4 years of correspondence between Robert and Whitmore, that documented, in precise chronological detail, exactly how the fraud had been constructed and executed. There was a personal journal, leather-bound and densely written, that contained Robert's own account of the entire period, his realizations, his fears, his reasoning, and finally his decision. And there were engineering documents, the full technical specification for his engine management system, complete with development notes and dated entries that established irrefutable intellectual priority. There was also, tucked in the back of the last folder, a sealed letter addressed to Victoria specifically, which Daniel did not look at, and which Victoria read in the bank's small conference room, with the door closed, alone, for nearly an hour, while Daniel sat in the lobby and drank terrible coffee and waited without complaint. What emerged from that safe deposit box had the potential to destroy a corporation, Whitmore Industries. The company that Edward Whitmore had built on the back of Robert Harlan's stolen technology had grown in the intervening 20 years into a billion-dollar enterprise with government contracts and a public profile as an innovation leader. The company had powerful legal resources and a history of defending itself aggressively against anything that threatened its position. Within 48 hours of Daniel and Victoria beginning to work with a legal team Victoria trusted, Whitmore's representatives made contact. The approach was layered and, to someone who had not been expecting it, might have seemed reasonable. First came an offer, a settlement, private and substantial, that would resolve all questions about intellectual property and allow all parties to move forward without litigation. The number attached was significant enough that Daniel understood it was meant to communicate the seriousness of Whitmore's desire to make this go away quietly. Then came pressure, a call to Daniel's own lawyer, a man named Thomas who had been practicing in the county for 30 years, suggesting that Daniel's possession and use of the documents could expose him to legal liability if he was not careful about how he proceeded. Then came something that was not quite a threat, but was arranged to feel like one. A visit from two men in expensive suits who presented themselves as consultants and sat in Daniel's kitchen and talked for 40 minutes about the complexity of property rights as they pertain to items recovered from real estate and to the importance of working with the right advisors. Daniel offered them both coffee, which they declined. He listened to everything they said with complete attention, and then he told them, with the same measured directness he had used with everyone who had arrived at his property over the preceding week, that he was not interested in a private settlement, that he was not interested in money in exchange for silence, and that they were welcome to stay as long as they liked, but that he would not be changing his answer. After they left, he called Thomas and told him that he was going to need a referral to someone who worked in corporate fraud. Thomas gave him two names and also told him, with the candor of a man who had known Daniel for years, that he was either very brave or very foolish, and that, in his experience, those two things were often the same thing at the moment they were happening. Daniel thanked him and said he thought that was probably true. Victoria, watching all of this from a proximity that grew closer as the days passed, began to understand something about Daniel Mercer that she had not anticipated when she stepped off the helicopter. She had arrived prepared for negotiation, for the calculation of leverage, for the management of someone whose cooperation she needed and whose interests were likely to diverge from her own at some unpredictable point. She was experienced at all of these things and was genuinely good at them. What she had not prepared for was a man who was not calculating at all, not because he was naive or indifferent to consequences, but because he had some internal standard against which he measured his own actions that was entirely independent of outcome. She recognized it partly because she had seen it in her father, in the memories she had of him from before everything went wrong, and partly because she had spent 20 years in environments where almost everyone was calculating all the time, and she had forgotten, somewhere along the way, that there was another way to be. She did not say any of this to Daniel directly. Neither did he say anything to her about the way she had begun to stay later in the evenings, sometimes until 9 or 10 at night, sitting across from him at the kitchen table, with case documents spread between them, while Sophie, who had arrived for her weekend visit and immediately decided that Victoria was fascinating, drew pictures at the other end of the table and asked occasional questions that made both adults stop and think. What developed between them was not hurried and did not announce itself. It had the quality of something structural, the way a foundation is laid before the walls go up, quietly and below the surface, and only becomes visible when the thing built on top of it is already standing. The hearing was held on a Thursday in January, in a federal courthouse in the city, in a room that was large and formal and full of people who had various stakes in the outcome: lawyers, journalists, representatives from several regulatory bodies, and in the gallery, a scattering of individuals who had worked with Robert Harland and who had wondered for 20 years what had actually happened. The documents from the safe deposit box had been authenticated, cataloged, and entered into evidence. The engineering specifications had been reviewed by 3 independent experts, all of whom confirmed their priority date and their authorship. The correspondence between Robert and Whitmore, read chronologically and in full, told a story that was both specific in its details and depressingly familiar in its structure. A powerful man with financial resources, using those resources to reshape the historical record in his own favor, counting on the target of his manipulation being too isolated and too overwhelmed to fight back effectively. Robert Harland had not been too overwhelmed. He had simply been, at the critical moment, afraid that the fight, even if he eventually won it, would consume everything before it was over. The letter in his journal made this clear in his own words. The lead attorney for Victoria's team, a sharp and unhurried woman named Patricia, who had spent 20 years on financial fraud cases and had a reputation for reading a deposition the way a musician reads a score, finding the rhythm beneath the surface, the places where the notes did not quite match the intention, laid out the evidence methodically over the course of 2 days. By the end of the first day, it was apparent to most observers that the case had already been decided in any meaningful sense, that what remained was the procedural work of formalizing an outcome that the documents had determined. On the second afternoon, the presiding judge announced that the evidence supported a full investigation of Whitmore Industries' financial records going back 20 years, that the intellectual property in question had been conclusively established as belonging to the estate of Robert Harland, and that the findings would be referred to the appropriate federal agencies for further action. In the gallery, one of Robert Harland's former colleagues, a white-haired man named George, who had worked with him for 6 years and had never entirely believed the story Whitmore's people had told, put his hand over his mouth and sat very still for a long moment before he composed himself. The moment the hearing adjourned, Daniel stood up from his seat behind the legal team, walked out into the corridor, and called Sophie. She was at school. He left a voicemail telling her that everything had gone well and that he would explain when he picked her up on Friday. Then he walked to the window at the end of the corridor and looked out at the gray January sky and felt something he had not felt in a very long time, which was a kind of lightness, not happiness exactly, but the specific sensation of having done something correctly and completely, of having held something valuable and returned it to its rightful place and being finished. He heard footsteps behind him and knew without turning around that it was Victoria. She stood beside him and looked out the same window. After a moment, she said, "I don't know how to thank you." He said, "You don't need to." They stood there for a while in the light from the gray January window, and neither of them said anything else, and that was enough for that particular moment. 1 month later, on a Saturday morning in February when the light was coming back, and the air still carried the cold, but had started to smell, faintly, of the possibility of something else, Victoria Harland drove up the gravel road to the farmhouse on Alden Road in a rental car rather than a helicopter. The difference was not small. She knocked on the door, and Daniel opened it holding a cup of coffee, and he looked at her for a moment without speaking, because her manner was different from any version of it he had seen before, quieter, less armored, as if she had set something down somewhere and had not yet decided whether to pick it back up. She was carrying a leather portfolio, and from it she produced an envelope, which she held out to him. He took it and looked at it. Inside was a check for $10 million. He looked at her. She looked back at him steadily, in the way she had of meeting things directly, and she said, "Before you say what you're about to say, this is not payment for the car." He waited. "It is not payment for anything you did," she continued. "It is what my father would have wanted given to the person who made it possible to restore his name. He was very specific about what he believed people like you deserved. And $10 million was, I think, a conservative estimate. Daniel looked at the check for a long moment. He was a mechanic. He was a man who fixed things for a living, who found value in the concrete and the functional, who had always been slightly suspicious of money that arrived without a corresponding amount of work behind it. But he was also a man who had spent 38 years learning to recognize when something was true and when it was not, and the thing Victoria was telling him was true, in a way that made the number almost incidental. It was not about the money. It never had been. He folded the check back into the envelope and set the envelope on the table between them. Then he said, "You said you had another proposal." She had, in fact, mentioned this in a brief message she had sent him a week earlier, and he had been thinking about it since. She opened the portfolio again and set a document on the table beside the envelope. Not a contract, but a letter of intent, 2 pages, that outlined the structure of what she was proposing. A foundation, to be called the Harland Foundation for Engineering Excellence, which would fund a program of classic automotive preservation and a scholarship initiative for young engineers from underprivileged backgrounds, both of which had been, as she explained it, causes her father had spoken about throughout her childhood and which had never been realized because everything had been derailed before it could begin. She was proposing to capitalize the foundation generously. She was proposing that Daniel serve as its operating director, with full authority over the workshop and preservation program, and a seat on the board that oversaw the scholarship decisions. She said it without pressure, in the same way she said most things as an offer, not a demand, laid out clearly so that whoever was receiving it could make a real decision about it. Daniel read both pages of the letter of intent carefully, the way he read anything important slowly, without skipping, going back to reread the parts that needed to be understood rather than merely processed. Sophie was at the kitchen table behind him, supposedly doing homework but actually drawing horses, as she had been doing constantly since Victoria had, on her last visit, mentioned that she kept 2 horses at a property she owned outside the city and had offered to take Sophie to see them sometime. When Daniel finished reading, he set the letter down and looked at Sophie for a moment, and then he looked at Victoria, and he asked one question. He asked whether the foundation's work would be in the garage on this property, whether the preservation workshop would be here, on Alden Road, in the space where he had found the car. Victoria said yes. That was, she said, the intention, if he agreed. The garage, with some renovation, was exactly the right size and exactly the right setting for the kind of work she was envisioning. She had, she admitted, taken the liberty of getting a structural assessment done, and the results were encouraging. He signed the letter of intent that afternoon at the kitchen table, with Sophie's horse drawings spread out around it and a pot of coffee on the stove. The check went into the safe in his bedroom, where it sat for 3 days before he deposited it. Not from hesitation, but from a kind of deliberateness that it was the right one, and the brief interval of sitting with a thing before acting on it was a habit he had developed long ago and had no intention of abandoning now that the stakes had grown larger. Over the following months, the farmhouse on Alden Road was transformed. Not quickly, and not all at once, but with the patient, methodical attention that Daniel brought to every restoration project, which this was, in the most literal sense, a restoration of a building and a purpose and a story that had been interrupted for too long. The porch was rebuilt. The roof was replaced. The interior walls were stripped to their original plank construction and refinished. The garage especially, was renovated from the ground up. New floor, new ventilation, new lighting, equipment installed with the same precision that Daniel applied to an engine rebuild, every tool in its place, every surface clean and accessible, and ready for work. The BMW M1 was carefully transported to a conservation specialist in the city for professional preservation treatment. And when it returned 3 months later, it was installed in a purpose-built display space in the front section of the garage, behind glass, with a card mounted beside it that told the story in plain language, not the version that had appeared in the press, with its emphasis on dollar values and legal drama, but the simpler version. A man had hidden something true in a place where it would survive until the right person found it. It had survived. The right person had found it. The truth had done what truth, given enough time, tends to do. The first scholarship recipients were announced in October. 12 young engineers from across the country. each of them from circumstances that made the path to engineering education something other than straightforward, each of them with a quality in their applications that the selection committee, chaired by Victoria with Daniel's input, described in its public statement as a fundamental seriousness about the work itself, independent of what the work might provide them. They attended an orientation weekend at the farmhouse in early November, these 12 young people. And they stood in the garage and looked at the BMW behind its glass and asked questions about it, and Daniel answered the questions with a specificity and a pleasure that anyone watching him would have recognized as a man in exactly the right place. On a Sunday evening in late November, after the orientation weekend had concluded and the last of the scholarship recipients had headed back to their respective cities, Victoria found Daniel in the workshop section of the garage, doing what he did when he needed to think, which was to work on something with his hands. He was refinishing a set of original wheel centers from a 1964 Porsche that had come in for assessment that week, and he was doing it with the methodical attention that made watching him oddly soothing, the way certain kinds of mastery, when witnessed up close, produce in observers something between admiration and peace. She stood in the doorway for a moment before he noticed her. When he looked up, she said she had been thinking about something his neighbor, Walter, had said at the ceremony, when the garage had officially opened the month before. Walter, who had filmed the original video that had started everything, and who had delivered a short, embarrassing, and entirely sincere speech about the importance of being the kind of person who digs when the shovel hits metal, rather than walking away. Victoria said she had been thinking that she had spent 20 years not digging. That she had known, somewhere beneath everything, that the story she had been told about her father was not complete, that she had the resources and the intelligence to have looked harder than she had. Daniel listened to her say this, and then he set down the wheel center he was working on and said, with the directness that had been, from the beginning, of the thing she had most trusted about him, "You were grieving. Grieving and doing are not the same thing, and neither of them is wrong." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "No, but they're both hard." He said, "Yes." They drove the BMW for the first time in late November, on the Sunday before Thanksgiving, not the restored original, which lived behind glass in the museum section of the garage, but a period-correct M, one that Victoria had located through a European collector and acquired for the Foundation's educational collection, with the understanding that cars that were meant to be driven should be driven. The road they chose was a 2-lane county highway that ran through farmland south of the property, straight and unhurried, lined with bare trees that made the gray sky feel close and intimate. Daniel drove. Victoria sat in the passenger seat. Sophie, wrapped in a coat that was slightly too big for her, was in the back, looking out the window at the fields passing by and asking, in the way she had that made both adults smile, whether the car had a name. Daniel said he hadn't given it one. Sophie said all cars should have names and would think of one by the time they got back. Victoria said that sounded like a very good use of a drive. The engine was correct in a way that Daniel, even fully prepared for it, found still managed to be surprising, not loud but thorough, filling the cockpit with a depth of sound that felt less mechanical than physical, a vibration that carried information about combustion and reciprocation, and the controlled conversion of energy into motion. He drove at a moderate speed and did not try to demonstrate anything because the car did not need demonstration, and because the point of the drive was not to go anywhere in particular but simply to be in motion together, which was its own thing entirely. They drove for 40 minutes out and 40 minutes back. And when Daniel pulled back into the gravel drive and shut the engine off, the quiet that followed was the good kind of quiet, full rather than empty. Sophie announced from the back seat that she had decided the car's name was Franklin, and that she had decided this because Franklin was a name that sounded like someone who had waited a long time to be useful and was finally getting the chance. Daniel looked in the rearview mirror at his daughter, who had already moved on to looking out the window at something in the field, and felt something that settled in his chest with the permanence of a correctly made repair. Solid, correct, finished. Victoria looked over at him from the passenger seat with an expression he had not seen on her before, which was simply happy, unguarded, and uncomplicated. the expression of someone who has arrived somewhere they did not know they were looking for, and finds that it is right. Some things buried in the ground are put there to hide. Some are put there to preserve, and some, though the people who bury them may not always fully understand this at the time, are put there to find the right person. To wait as patiently as metal and glass and leather can wait, through seasons and silence and the long, slow accumulation of years, until someone arrives with a shovel and the honesty to ask the right questions. Robert Harland had known something, in the end, about what he was doing. Even if he could not have known all of it, he had known that the thing he was leaving behind was not a vehicle. It was a test, and somewhere beneath the fear and the failure and the 20 years of silence, he had trusted correctly. As it turned out that the world still contained people who would pass it, the garage on Alden Road became, in the years that followed, something small and specific and genuine. A workshop where old machines were returned to themselves, where young engineers learned that understanding something deeply required patience and attention and a willingness to be wrong, and where a BMW that had spent 20 years in the ground stood behind glass as a reminder that the most important things are very rarely the most obvious ones. Daniel ran the workshop with the same directness and care he had always applied to everything. Victoria visited often less as a founder and more, over time, as someone who had found a place where the version of herself she most wanted to be was also the version that seemed to fit most naturally. Sophie grew and learned to identify engines by sound, and continued to name cars, and became, at the age of 12, the youngest person ever to correctly diagnose a carburetor issue in the Foundation's educational workshop, a fact that Daniel mentioned only once in public and replayed privately with significant frequency. And the farmhouse on Alden Road, which the people of the town had called cursed for 20 years, became something else entirely. Not famous, not spectacular, but full in the way that places become full when the right people are in them doing the right work, when the history of a place is finally allowed to resolve itself into something that makes sense, when what was buried comes back to the surface and turns out, against all probability, to have survived intact. There are treasures, as Robert Harland had perhaps known when he chose his words with such care, that are not buried to be kept. They are buried to be found, and the finding, when it finally comes, is never just about the thing itself. It is about what the thing was always waiting to do, which is to bring together, at exactly the right moment, exactly the right people, so that whatever was broken can finally, completely, be made whole.